Hi, this is Misha, and this is part 2 on our Swedish video series. This one is covering the service handguns. And in my hands is a Swedish model 1887, or just called the M87 by the Swedish Navy, Nagant revolver. This is chambered for 7.5 ordnance, the same round as is used in the Swiss Schmidt 1882 and 1929 revolvers. Pretty straightforward revolver. We've got a 4.5-inch barrel, 6-shot cylinder, double single action trigger system, very traditional. Unlike with a Russian Nagant revolver, the cylinder does not go forward when you pull, so the trigger pull is much nicer on these. And just general fit and finish is better as well. It has an octagonal barrel here, wood grips, lanyard loop, pretty standard revolver. Well, in 1884, the Swedish government, the Swedish military, held trials to select a new standard issue service revolver, and no one really won. But they were impressed with the Swiss 1882 Schmidt and the Norwegian 1883 Nagant. So what they did is they contacted Nagant himself in Belgium and asked if he could come help and make some small changes and also chamber his gun for the Swiss round, and he did, and that's where this came from in 1887. The first purchase order from FN Herstal in Belgium, well, actually it wasn't FN back then, but the first purchase from Nagant, his corporation, I should say, his factory in Belgium, was for 2,600. The Navy would adopt it in 1891 as, again, the M87, and they would purchase 500. So you've got a little over 3,000 from Belgium. Well, in 1897, Sweden would purchase production rights for these, and between that year and 1905, the Husqvarna factory would produce between 13 and 14,000 Swedish 1897 revolvers. And that was pretty much it for production. So fewer than 20,000 ever made. Now, as you see, the cylinder turns freely on this, which is common for a lot of the earlier revolvers of this era. Well, they did make a version, an adaptation, a modification that would stop the cylinder more like a modern revolver. It was designated as the 1887/93. However, the upgrade was not mandatory, and officers had to pay for the upgrade themselves. So most of them didn't do it. So that's why most of them are like this. It feeds from a loading gate, much like on a a Russian Nagant, just pretty standard here. I mean, and very typical revolver for the day. So if I do this here. If I can line it up on camera, but you see, there we go. You got to actually do it manually. You got to rotate the cylinder manually. Just a very basic revolver. Well made, but basic. And as you see, when you pull the trigger, it doesn't work like on a Swiss where you can rotate the cylinder too with the gate open. This one's really stiff, sorry. Around there. But this was standard issue in Sweden until the early 20th century. Initially, these were adopted for use by officers. Afterwards, they started to be issued to artillerymen and then field medics. By World War I, these were out of frontline service and just kind of in secondary use. By World War II, about the only folks still carrying the 1887 were the Home Guard. Now, interestingly, in 1954, Husqvarna bought back a lot of these, as many as they could. They refurbished them, and they sold them off on the surplus market through Interarms. Probably the last user of these revolvers, and actually they kept them around for a really long time, were the Swedish Postal Service officials. So quite a few of these were carried during the Cold War era by post office workers, but then again, they didn't need an up-to-date type gun. yeah, just the Swedish Nagant revolver. Very well made, not very heavy. The 7.5 cartridge is alright, but it's a little anemic. It was moderately powerful by the standards of the late 19th century, but by the 20th century it was quite weak. Well, that was the last revolver really in use in Sweden. What came next is this one here. This is the Swedish model 1907 automatic pistol. This is a Browning design. Pretty typical. This is a variant of the FN model 1903. Typical. Is a direct blowback gun. It is chambered for 9x20 semi-rimmed, which when this was adopted was the most powerful cartridge available for a blowback gun. It was basically the big brother to 7.65 by 17 SR, both developed by John Browning. Today these are pretty well out of use, but I mean the 9x20 didn't stay around like 32 did, but still. Shrouded hammer. We have two safeties. We've got a safety here, thumb safety, and we've got a grip safety back here. Synthetic grips. Otherwise a pretty basic gun. As you saw, it does have a last round holdback, but it does not have a manual release. This is the device on the right side here, and there's no way to activate it by your finger, so you have to drop it. It disassembles much like any other Browning. But yeah. Well, they weren't typically all that happy with the revolver. It worked fine, but by the 20th century they needed something that was more powerful, cheaper to produce, durable, reliable, and they were thinking to try one of the new semi-automatic pistols that were becoming in vogue then. So that in around 1904, 1905, they had trials, and they looked at all the early ones of the day. Obviously the FN 1903, the Luger 1900, the Mannlicher 1894, the 1896 broom handle, so on and so forth. The usual list of guns you'll see in trials at that era. Well, they narrowed it down between the 1903 and this 9x20 caliber and the Luger model 1900 chambered for 7.65 millimeter parabellum. That was in 1906. They really liked the Luger, but they eventually selected the FN, the Browning design, because it was cheaper to produce, it was a little more reliable in the cold, it disassembled easier into larger parts for their soldiers, and the 9x20 cartridge was more powerful than the old 7.5 ordnance, so that helped. The Luger was really liked for its accuracy, ergonomics, and elegance, but it was a little expensive and not quite as reliable when very cold and in the dirt and the mud. So they designed this to be a very robust, cold weather, simple gun. So they had a contract with FN. They had a few changes they wanted to do. They wanted the extractor to be strengthened, which they did. They wanted a larger thumb safety here, which they did. They wanted a lanyard ring. That's pretty much it. Pretty well standard gun. The first 10,000 of these were purchased from FN prior to World War I, but then World War I got in the way. Same story you hear with a lot of guns. So FN could no longer deliver pistols because it had been Belgium had been overrun by the Germans. So Sweden purchased the production rights to these, and in 1917 Husqvarna started building the 1907 pistol, and between that year and 1941, 42, somewhere in that era, they produced about 89,000. So just shy of 100,000 model 1907s were produced, a large number, which is good. We'll get to in a bit. These actually had a twilight career. But yeah, simple, durable little gun. However, the cartridge, again, reasonably powerful when it was adopted, but after World War I, after seeing the Colt 45 and the Luger 9mm, it was already kind of looking a little bit on the weak side. So this is going to cause some issues. So they even as early as 1925, they were kind of wanting to replace this with a more powerful, more modern gun. But World War I had ended, much like a lot of small European nations. Wishful thinking, they thought the Great War was the end of all wars. So the defense budget was cut, didn't have a lot of money, and Europe was suffering a depression. So there just wasn't money to buy a new pistol. So these would have to, stay in production, make do. And they were relatively cheap to produce because they were a simple blowback gun. Easy to use, just again, not all that powerful. However, by the 1930s, by 1937 or so, they had to face facts that war was coming, and they allocated money to purchase new automatics. And that's where this came from here. This is a Swedish M39, chambered for 9x19 Luger. If this looks familiar, that is because this is a Walther HP, which is the commercialized version of the P38. It actually predates the P38. This is an early design, so it's going to have a few differences. The firing pin is actually square. The safety is a little bit larger. The sights have a different contour to them. This V-notch in the back. The biggest difference are these checkered Bakelite grips with the round lanyard loop here. But yeah, in 1939, Sweden purchased first 1,000 of these from Walther, which were delivered late 1939, and then Walther was able to deliver another 500 in 1940. However, obviously by that point, Germany itself is engaged in war. Walther can't really supply Sweden pistols in large quantity, in large numbers. Well, they thought about buying a production license like they'd done with the previous two guns. However, they quickly discovered, because the P38, the HP, was produced at the time with very advanced technology. It used some stampings, the machining it was a very advanced gun for its day, partially because of this single double action trigger system, which was just new for the time. And so they realized they didn't have the industrial base to produce these under license. So they had 1,500, that was about it. A few more came in here and there over the World War II that were brought over by soldiers. But that was pretty much it. Why this pistol is important for Sweden is it got them over to using the 9x19 Parabellum cartridge. So that's why this one's important. And don't worry, we'll address the P38 in a later video dedicated just to the P38 development. So you'll see this gun again because it's important for being an early production. This one is actually part of the first Swedish contract, serial number in the 1600 range, and they range from 1,000 to 2,000 in that contract, and they have an H prefix. So this is one of the first 1,000 that were sent to Sweden. The second production batch of 500 look more like P38s. They still use this grip, but they have the later style sights, firing pin, safety, so that they were already adapting some changes. Well, what they ended up adopting, since the HP didn't work out, the M39, is this one over here. This is a Swedish produced M40 Lahti pistol. Well, Sweden had sent about 8,000 soldiers over to help Finland during its winter war with Russia. In addition, they had already been producing the Suomi submachine gun as the M37 and later M37-39, so they were familiar with Emil Lahti's designs. So they came back, they said, hey, Finland's got this new pistol. They have very similar production capabilities that we do, old style machining and whatnot. So the Swedish government, the Swedish military, approached VKT in Finland to try to get a license to produce the Lahti. Now, VKT sent 50 of their Lahtis over to to Sweden, which were used by the Air Force, I believe. It might have been the Navy, I apologize, I don't recall. The small batch that they had to work with. And they purchased a production license in 1940, which is why this is the M40. Well, problem. Husqvarna, who'd made the previous two handguns, was very busy with rifle contracts, and Carl Gustav, who you know from our first video on the on the Mausers was also busy producing what would become the AG-42 Lumen. So neither company could do it. So what they did is they approached an unknown, a company, a manufacturer who had never made a handgun before, called Rosenford Bruck. Now, they tried to make them, it didn't work. I'm not going to get into the story too much. You can check our blog for more details. But Rosenford tried to make pistols. They made a small production run of frames. They were deemed unacceptable. It didn't work out, so they had to trash them. Luckily, during the interval, now we're getting into 1941, Husqvarna freed up some production capacity and started to make these. Now, early on, the Swedish Lahti is very similar. This is a late production one, by the way. Was very similar to the Finnish version, except they lacked the loaded chamber indicator. The very first ones had it. They machined it off and welded it up, but either way, they lacked it. And they went to a thicker and larger trigger guard. They also went to a captive recoil spring in the back. So you had one less part to come out when you disassembled it. Well, production started off pretty slow, but by 1942 they were starting to crank these out, and they did one giant production run between 1941 and 1946. In that interval, they made 80,000, give or take, of these pistols. Keep in mind, Finland made 9,000 of their L35 Lahtis, so Sweden produced a lot more. As production went on, they made some other changes. They simplified the front sight. They went to a simple square base. They added a nut on the barrel for easy removal of the barrel, because the Swedes like to replace barrels when they get worn. Grips also could either be black early on or reddish brown. And they reinforced the slide with this step here near the accelerator. The reason they did that, during World War II, Sweden had a shortage of steel. So they had to save the best steel for the bolt and the barrel. Unfortunately, that meant for the slide and the frame, they had to use steel with molybdenum in it, which was weaker, so they had to reinforce it some. Well, the Lahti is an interesting pistol. We've already had a little video on the Finnish one. We might revisit it later. It's kind of based on the old 1910 Bergman. Cock it in the back. It's a very massive gun. Fires 9x19 parabellum. Like the Finnish version, the Swedish version has a bolt accelerator in here to help it work in the cold. Has a last round hold open, but no release lever, so you have to drop your mag. Here you go. It has an 8-round detachable box mag with this little toe on it. Again, it's identical to the Finn version. Bakelite grips. Heel-mounted mag release, just like the previous 1907. Very easy disassembly. Just flip this toggle down. Just comes apart in just 4 or 5 very big pieces. Single action only trigger. Has a stock slot in the back, but very few stocks were ever made for these in Sweden. Well, these had kind of an interesting history during World War II. Oh, and the safety, I'm sorry. It does have a manual safety here, very typical. What's kind of neat, when it's on safe, it rides back on the grip, so when you grip it, you can feel the safeties on in the web of your hand very easily, and that way you know. It's a little hard to actuate. You have to kind of relocate your hand, but you can do it. It's okay. And the sights are actually pretty good on these. They're pretty large. And again, these pistols are made for cold weather. They're very large and overbuilt, but we'll get to that. Not so strong. But anyway, in 1943. Some of these were given to the Norwegian dissidents who were fighting the Nazis. And then in 1944, some were given to the Danes in exile. About, I think it's about 1,000 were given initially. And then the Danish government in exile ordered more, about 2,500. Well, Denmark was freed in 1945, and they used quite a few of these in that process. The Danes called this the model or the M40S. So they had over 3,000 at that point. Well, after they reestablished their government, they ordered 10,000, which would have a D prefix to the serial. And then they had a final order in 1946 for 2,000, which would have RPLT on them. So these were mostly used by police, but some by the military. So they actually would have in total, and it looks like a couple of the contracts weren't completely fulfilled because of the number, but around 13,500 were in Danish service as well, which is kind of interesting because that's double, or just about double, what were actually used in Finland. So even though this gun was designed in Finland, more were used in Denmark, and definitely more were used in Sweden. Alright, so this was the standard issue sidearm in Sweden after World War II, and it would remain in service throughout the Cold War. However, the shortcut they took using the molybdenum in the steel would lead to cracking here. So replacement slides made by Gustav in the 60s would lack the bolt accelerator altogether, trying to make it stronger. And they were having issues. Now, the real reason was they were using a loading of 9mm intended for the Suomi submachine gun, which is really hot. It's worth noting that Danish contract guns like this one aren't known for cracking because the Danes used regular 9x19 parabellum in them as opposed to a hotter loading. Anyway, they were having issues with that. And in 1991, a pistol cracked, exploded, injured a shooter in Sweden, and they were all very rapidly pulled out of service at that point. Anyway, by 1991 they were getting very old, so I'm sure they were ready to replace them. But they pulled about 50,000 that were still in service out. They figured out the problem, the less than ideal steel used, and they melted them all down. They refused to sell them as surplus, and they melted them down. So although they made 80,000 or plus, probably fewer than 25,000 of these still remain in the world, because the majority were melted down. Well, in 1993, that was replaced what is becoming, pretty quickly, the ubiquitous Glock. They adopted it as the P88, and this is a Glock 19 Gen 2. I pulled the Gen 2 out because they adopted the Glock in 1993, so they would have had Gen 2s. They adopted the 17 for use by standard issue, and the 19 for use by Air Force and other specialties. And we'll have a video on Glocks and do some other stuff, but there's tons of stuff out there on them, so I didn't want to get too in-depth with it. But yeah, Sweden, after using the Lahti, before that the M07, and before that the Nagant revolver went to the Glock. Oh, as a side note with the 1907, when the Lahti pistols were having cracking issues, 70s and 80s, a good number of these, remember they produced a lot, nearly 100,000 total they had. They pulled quite a few of these out of storage in the 80s as a temporary stopgap measure and pulled a lot of the M40s out of service. So these actually had a little twilight career where they were in use in the 80s, at least by some units, as a sidearm. Not powerful like the Lahti, less weaker cartridge, but they weren't known for cracking. They had more faith in them, so kind of an interesting little twilight career these guns had. Well, this is Misha, and as always, thanks for tuning in. And if you have any questions at all, please post them in the comments and we'll do our best to address them. Catch you next time.